Good afternoon. I'm Professor Victor Ponce, and this is CIVE 634, Surface Water Hydrology. This is our class 041. That is the fourth week, the first class. Today, the subject is infiltration. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the syllabus. Today is the fourth week, and the fourth week is, the subject is infiltration. So we have 2 days, meaning 150 minutes. That's actually 2.5 hours, today and Wednesday, to cover the material, infiltration material. And what we have in infiltration is a very complex subject. But I would say more than 90% of the work, 90, no more than 90, 95% of the work that is done in infiltration out there in the real world is the curve number. So we are going to emphasize the curve number because I know perhaps many of you don't have any experience with the curve number because somehow that's the way it happened, right? So I'm going to discuss the curve number, the runoff curve number. Fortunately, your professor is supposed to be an expert on this subject. This is one of my strong subjects. And I got to be good in infiltration, or rather runoff curve number, just by sheer luck. But let me just say that at this point, we are going to cover 7 items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The first one is the paper I wrote in 1996 with Richard Hawkins. That's going to take us all day today, or a little less perhaps. I'm going to try to speed up in here. I still hold you responsible for reading the entire paper because I'm going to query you on the exam, which is coming up on the 8th week, and today is the 4th week, so in 4 weeks. Then every paper has a discussion. Every paper that is published in a journal gets a discussion. So discussion, the runoff curve number, several authors. I have 3 authors discussing my paper. 2 of them were just normal discussions, and the third one was a little bit belligerent, should I say. So I want you to read particularly the third one, so you can see what lies out there in the real world when you write a paper and somebody happens to disagree with you. I'll fill you more in this later on. Then we'll go over the closure, because after people discuss your paper, you have a chance to close the paper, meaning you have the last word on the subject matter. So we close the paper. And by the way, Hawkins is my co-author. I'll talk about Hawkins later on. Then we are going to cover my conversation with Vic Marcus. That is, this conversation with Vic Marcus has made me famous in the field. I worked so hard in many difficult papers, and none of them made me famous. This one made me famous, and you're going to see why. We also have a video, and we'll discuss that later on. I posted the video yesterday because I happen to have it out there, and this is a new video because no, I'm sorry, not that. The next one, the CN oral interview. It's a new video. It was done a year ago, so I did not have a chance to talk about this video in the previous iteration of this class, which was 2 years ago. So this is new. This material, CO5, is new, and I thought about it yesterday and today, and I'm going to stress that you watch this video at least once, if not more. It's a 70-minute video, 90-minute video, and for that matter, I'm going to make sure that I ask at least a couple questions out of the midterm is coming up in 4 weeks. A couple questions on the midterm will be on the content and the discussions that ensued on this particular video. So I want you to see it, to watch it. We're not going to be able to watch all the video because if we watch all the video that we cover, we don't have any time for lecturing. So I'll just touch a little bit here and there on that video. Very important video. I've watched it 3 or 4 times over the last couple of years, or the last year and a half actually. And I'm really pleased the way that thing came out. Finally, on CO6 Initial Abstraction Revisited, this is a very advanced paper. I'm not sure that I'm going to stress it too much. I'll just touch base on it maybe 5-10 minutes. And finally, a story and a video. So let's get started here. Runoff curve number, has it reached maturity? Everybody can see the green page?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, green page, okay. The story on this is on the video on the oral history. And I'll explain more on the background of the CN oral history video later on when we get there. But in this case, in 1993, I was invited by the Army Corps of Engineers to give a lecture on routing in Denver, because routing has always been my expertise from the beginning, from the early 70s. Um, and I met personally. In other words, I actually got to meet Richard Hawkins, who has been and still is an emeritus professor over at University of Arizona. Richard is a very, or his name is Pete actually. He goes by Pete. Pete's a very good guy, nice guy, and we really got to talking. And I suggested to him, because I had a record of publications, but it was not in the curve number. And Pete had a record of publications, and it was almost exclusively in the curve number. So by 1993, when we got together, I had had at least 15 years of publications of all sorts of topics. I cover a lot of ground. And Pete, for good or worse, he had covered only the curve number. He was a curve number expert. He was recognized around the world as a curve number expert, which I was not. So then I thought I would pair with him and write a paper on the curve number, because I happen to be a good writer and how can I say, a prolific writer. And Pete knew the curve number back and forth. So I figured we both could be a good team. So he agreed, and we worked for a couple of years. In 1996, we published this paper, Runoff Curve Number, Has It Reached Maturity? Our intent was to buttress, to underpin the curve number. Why? Because the curve number had been around for 40 years, and it was being, should I say, attacked. It was being criticized by many people as too simple, and doesn't work here, doesn't work there, and so on and so forth. And many were arguing that the SCS or somebody else should do a replacement of the curve number. So I said to Pete, I said, let's work on a paper on the curve number, all the ins and outs, the goods, the bads, the ugly, whatever. We're going to put it all out together. Okay. I did have a bias, and I always have a bias. People have biases. My bias was in favor of the curve number, and let me tell you why. Because there's many other methods out there that could conceivably replace the curve number, but none of them could prove that they're better. None of them. Okay, they're fine and here and there. All methods have their drawbacks and limitations, but there was no method at the time that could say, I am the method, I'm better, definitely better than the other method. So we decided to do a defense, not a defense, but we decided to write a positive article on the curve number. So that's the story of this paper. Okay? For those of you that are not familiar with, in the late 40s and early 50s, the Soil Conservation Service then later became the Natural Resources Conservation Service, because the federal government felt that there was no agency out there that was taking care of the specifically of the resources. So the resources are soil, nutrients, plants. And there was Soil Conservation Service, but there was no Nutrient Conservation Service, no Plant Conservation Service. So they decided to create an agency. But then later they got word, or something, the decision at the highest levels of authority here in this country was made to give the Soil Conservation Service the capability to analyze all the natural resources, and change the name of the agency. And that they did in 1996. So the Soil Conservation Service transformed into the Natural Resources Conservation Service in 1996. So when we now say SCS, it's not correct. SCS does not exist. Okay, but before 1996, we were doing this in 1994, 1995. We could not know what the government was going to do. So we talk about the Soil Conservation Service. This method was developed in 1954 by the Soil Conservation Service. What is the curve number? It's a method for the estimation of direct runoff from rainfall, well established in hydrologic engineering and environmental impact. Its popularity, it's rooted in its convenience. It is convenient. It's simple. Its authoritative origins, because it was endorsed and produced by a federal agency. and it was responsive to four readily grasped catchment properties: soil type, land use, surface condition, and antecedent condition. So that's the essence, in a nutshell, what the curve number is. Like I said, it was published in 1954. It has been used for almost more than 60 years now. It has its detractors. People don't like it, but most people really like it by way of practice. But it does have its problems. You got to really know the method well and have had experience with it before you can say that it is good. But like I said, I reiterate, none of the other methods could claim to be better, in my opinion. People, of course, disagree with me. Some people disagree with me, but that's okay. Let's leave it at that. Method's credibility and acceptance has suffered, however, due to its origin as agency methodology, which effectively isolated it from the rigors of peer review, meaning the agency had somebody doing the work for 20 years, by the way, and then published it. They publish it. There's no peer review, nothing. Peer review is something that is considered academic, and these guys are not academicians. They are people in the government, hydrologists of the government, the federal government hydrologists, okay? So there was no complete account at the beginning, and there was some politics, as usual, involved in the actual birth of the curve number, which I, by the way, eventually got to know, because I had that, like I said, I was in there, not right there, but later. I'm not old enough to have been there. In 1954, I was going to grade school, right? But eventually I have friends, I made acquaintances, they told me things that had happened at the time, so I happen to know almost the full story. The oral history project came about 2 years ago. People in ASCE got together and they felt that what they needed to do is to study the method in more detail. So they created this committee called the CN, meaning curve number, Oral History Project. And they've been doing this for the last year or so, interviewing just about everybody that is anybody in the issue of what is the curve number. And that's why they chose to interview me, and they did that in June of last year. So that's about 15 months ago. And you will see the entire interview, by the way. They put it on the web. It's a 90-minute interview. Interesting, really interesting how the history of the curve number. Now, let me just go ahead and continue this. What are we going to do in this paper? We are going to critically examine the curve number method to clarify its conceptual and empirical basis, to delineate its capabilities, limitations, and uses. Because the runoff curve number was being used and abused by people that didn't know or were not aware of its beginnings. So therefore, we felt that it was necessary that somebody come out and straighten things out, and to identify areas of research in runoff curve number methodologies. The issue whether the curve number is conceptual is something that I had a fight with Hawkins, because being a professor of hydrology, I classified in my book, which came out in 1989, all hydrology methods into deterministic, stochastic, or probabilistic, same thing, conceptual, and parametric, or empirical. And I already discussed that or talked to you about that. So out of these four categories, the best of these categories that fitted the curve number was conceptual. But nobody had come around to calling this method conceptual. So I said I wanted to introduce the concept that this method is conceptual. And I truly believe it's conceptual, and many people have already agreed with me. Hawkins didn't think so, though. Hawkins said it was empirical. I said, no, Pete, I've written the book. It is conceptual. And because I'm the senior author, we're going to go with it. Sorry about it. Okay, so we did. He had to take it. So the conceptual basis of the method has been the object of both support and criticism. So we do in this paper a complete history, well, not a complete, nothing is complete, but a very thorough analysis and description of what's going on in terms of infiltration modeling, okay? And as a matter of fact, I should point out to you that your Professor Ponce has written over the course of his career 52 journal publications, and they all have been cited, more or less, some papers more than others, And there is such a thing called the H index in academia, which describes the number of citations of your papers. And of all the papers that I've written, many have been cited many times, and some of them not too many times. Maybe at the lower end, we have a paper that has been cited maybe 2 or 3 times. But this paper has been cited on the order of 1,200 times. 1,200, the last time I checked. Well, one can check that readily. I didn't do that today, but 12 to 1,300. This is my most popular paper. I do not believe by any stretch of the imagination that it is my best paper, but it is the most popular. That is where I don't vote on popularity. Other people vote. I can choose my best paper, and I know which one is the Maescar paper, the one that I discussed last year in computational hydrology or hydraulics. Maescar paper is my best paper, but that's besides the point and not related to the subject today. Okay, so this is very popular paper because it's, first of all, it's easy to read. Second, it is important. If people are using the curve number, and I submit that of all hydrologic engineers, they use the curve number every day, all the time. All the hydrologic engineers, how many are they? A whole lot of people all over the world. So a very popular subject. So people that want to know about the curve number must read this paper because it is the condensation. And besides, I have a huge list of references. So if you want to pursue the subject, you can go to my list of references. I don't know how many, but it's probably 50 in there. That's usually the way we do it. Okay, so infiltration can be lumped or distributed. Lumped is in space and probably even in time. Distributed is when it varies from point to point. So there are advantages and disadvantages. The lump model is easier to handle. In the distributed model, it's more difficult and it varies in time and space, and it may be hard to pin down. But as I say in here, I define what lump model is and a distributed model is, so you should take a look at this. The relative advantages of distributed modeling versus lump modeling are not easily determined or are not readily, you can't determine that readily. You cannot say one is better than the other, okay? The spatial and temporal variability that prevails in almost all practical settings does not usually favor the distributed approach unless the nature of this variability can be specifically incorporated into the model, which is not a small task. Okay? The lump models owe their existence to our inability to properly account for the intrinsic variability of natural phenomena. Infiltration varies. It's interesting. I should mention this, and I think I already mentioned it. The rates of infiltration vary between 10 to the 0 centimeters per second to 10 to the minus 12 centimeters per second. So there is a 12 order of magnitude variability. And if we had to pin down, if that would be the real variability, the real range of variability, we could not do hydrology. Because you would get an answer of 10 to the minus 4, and somebody else would get an answer of 10 to the minus 5, which is 10 times better, 10 times smaller. But the range of variability is so huge that between 10 to the minus 4 and 10 to the minus 5, there's not a whole lot. So we couldn't pin it down. Fortunately, the actual variability, which is mostly loams or silts or sandy silts, which prevail in nature, the range of variability is within only 2 orders of magnitude. So we can do, in 2 orders of magnitude, we can do it, but not in 12. No variable that has 12 orders of magnitude variability in the real world has ever been pinned down for calculation. It's too much variability. The sediment calculation is not 2, it's 4. And being 4, it already throws a monkey wrench in the entire thing. And I think I'd said, if one of you guys gets 10 and the other one gets 20, that is 100% for an answer, I usually say, well, I think probably both of them are okay. Because it's very difficult to get 100% accuracy in sedimentation calculations. It's almost impossible, as a matter of fact, because of the range of the variability. Okay. Conversion of rainfall to runoff. The conversion of rainfall to runoff is the centerpiece of surface water modeling. Elementary expression of conservation of mass is, and we've already seen this in our previous discussions, Q is equal to P minus L. Q is runoff, P is rainfall, and L is the abstractive losses or hydrologic abstractions. The quantification of the abstractions can be complex. These fall into 5 categories: interception in the leaves, surface storage in ponds, puddles, infiltration to the surface, temporary, because eventually the infiltrated water, after a long time, after a month or two, it either comes back out through the plant, through the roots, or it goes into the base flow. But that takes time, and that's why we say this equation over here has to be interpreted in both a short-term basis and a long-term basis. And we already know that, by the way. I think I already discussed the differences between event, which is short, and yield, which is usually 1 year duration. So infiltration to the subsurface, evaporation from water bodies such as lakes, reservoirs, streams, and rivers, as well as from moisture on bare ground, and evapotranspiration from all types of vegetation. So these are the 5 paths that the water, when it has precipitated, can take. It is our job to figure out for specific sites how much under what conditions. That's what the hydrologists typically do, a water balance, right? And as you know, because the watersheds vary anywhere from like a few acres to hundreds of thousands of square miles, then it becomes a difficult job. I don't think anybody out there is out of their mind to go out there and do a study on the entire Amazon, because the entire Amazon basin is 8 million square kilometers or something on that order, huge, and it covers 8 countries. So if you're going to go out there to do the study, you're going to have to ask permission to 8 countries. Otherwise, they're not going to let you in for obvious reasons. So the Amazon's too big. But other basins that cover only 1 country can be attempted. And as a matter of fact, we've done that in many, many instances throughout my career. That's one of the things that we've done. Mostly flood, though. Very seldom that I have to do yield. Mostly flood, because I am supposed to be a water expert, and people do specialize. Okay, even remember at the beginning, I said that there was 96, or I think I said 106 types of hydrology. And if you're good, you can hope to specialize in maybe 10 at the most. So that means that you renege, you can't talk about the other subjects. Somebody else will come out and take those subjects. Okay, so that is that complicated, and we need to realize that. You cannot get into every subject, even in hydrology. Okay. The curve number method is an infiltration loss model. If it's infiltration, the focus, and that's exactly what it is. Therefore, its applicability is restricted to modeling storm losses, meaning short-term, meaning event. Short-term, storm, that is the same thing. Without modifications, the method should not be used to model the long-term hydrologic response of a catchment. However, it is recognized that some people out there in the real world are using this method, the runoff curve number method, for yield determinations. Why are they doing this? And the answer is because they have no other choice. There is no method for yield. Therefore, they're trying to stretch the range of limitation, or application of the curve number method. Let me also say at this point that Shetty and I in 1996 model or mimicked the work of Leibovich, and we came out with a yield method, which is very similar to the curve number, by the way. But the parameters for yield are totally different than the parameters for event. So even though the methods may look alike, the parameterization of the method is totally different. It should be understood. The event phenomenon is driven by completely different situation than a yield phenomenon. The event is a few days, or depending on the watershed, it could be a few weeks. But the yield is the total and complete year. And I think I already mentioned to you that there's one place around the world, as far as I know, which is the Upper Paraguay, that I talked to extensively, last Thursday to my other class. So some of you are taking the other class have already heard me talk about the Upper Paraguay. But in the Upper Paraguay, something really weird happens. Unusual, not weird. That the event hydrology is the same as the yield hydrology. Why is that? Because the basin is so mild. the general slope of the land out there is 0.00001 to 2. So 1 centimeter per kilometer. It's extremely mild, and that produces diffusion. Diffusion is a characteristic of flows, of unsteady flows, defined by the Hayami formula, which we talked about in computational hydraulics. You must remember, those of you that took computational hydraulics. The slope is in the denominator. So when the slope approaches 0, the diffusion goes to infinity. Diffusion infinity means the water is not moving. It's refusing to move. It's diffusing. It's staying around, sticking around. So that makes a lot of sense both mathematically as well as from experience. Modes of surface runoff generation. I'm going to try to speed up in here, otherwise we'll not finish as I had intended. There's various ways to look at surface runoff generation. Hortonian overland flow comes from Horton. Who was Horton? Horton is considered to be the father of American hydrology. He wrote two very basic papers in the 30s that began the scientific study, for all practical purposes, began the scientific study of hydrology. So he was given, I don't believe it's written anywhere, officially, but he's considered to be the father of America, one of the fathers of American hydrology. He developed the Horton method. Saturation over land flow is not the Horton method. It's totally different. It's the opposite, as a matter of fact. Through flow process was developed by some people out there in England that thought they were going to do something nice or new, and they published a book and considered to be part of the issue now. Partial area runoff, likewise, is true flow. Is true flow. Same thing. Very small people, or a small number of people are using these two concepts, number 3 and number 4. But for completeness, we wanted to put it in there so that people wouldn't come back afterwards and tell me, oh, hey, you didn't put the entire list. Direct channel interception. That is direct channel. It can rain into the channel. And at that point, there's no soil that gets into the picture. It's raining into the channel. Okay. And surface phenomena. This one's one that is very little treated in the books, by the way. Hardly any book talks about this. But of course, since I know, I wanted to talk about this. Surface phenomena is the cross development, hydrophobic soil layers, and frozen ground. Frozen ground, obviously, if the ground's frozen, you're not going to have any infiltration. But what are these hydrophobic soil layers? Hydro means water. Phobic means I don't like. So there are soil layers that don't like the water? And the answer is yes. If you want to figure out where this thing happens, it happens right here in Southern California. It happens in the South counties, all the way from perhaps LA, a little bit north of LA, south all the way into Mexico. Why is that? Why Mexico is involved? Because this hydrophobic soil layers is very tied with the Chaparral, the ecosystem, the Mediterranean ecosystem, which is called Chaparral, which of course you must know already. You live in San Diego, perhaps you were born in San Diego. This is the country of the Chaparral. The Chaparral existed here, my guess would be millions of years. We exist here in San Diego about 100 years. I think San Diego was founded in the early 1900s, so it may be 120 years at most, San Diego. Yet the Chaparral has been around here for millions of years. That we have affected a little bit the Chaparral, or a whole lot, depending on who you talk to. We have, because we had to build our cities, we had to cut the Chaparral. But wherever there is no city, and you notice I don't have to tell you this, there's Chaparral. And the Chaparral has a fascinating property, or you could say it's not property, it's a way of living, it's a way of growing, in that if it doesn't rain, and here in the Southland, it has a way of not raining maybe a couple of years. And the plant, most plants, if they don't get any water in a couple of years, they die. Not the Chaparral. The Chaparral is adapted to surviving an extreme drought. And how does it do it? It stops from evapotranspiring. It doesn't have any water to evapotranspire, so it will not evapotranspire, but it will not wilt. So how does it do that? It closes, the Chaparral closes its stomata with what is called aliphatic hydrocarbons. I think McPhee in his book wrote about it. The aliphatic hydrocarbons are there. And what happens is that when there's a fire, imagine there's a fire. Fires, we have anthropogenic fires now, but even without anthropogenic action, we would still have fires, much less number or intensity, but still fires. California, Southern California is fire country. So when the fire burns, the wax melts and it gets into the ground, it drops into the ground, and it creates the hydrophobic soil layer, meaning it does not let rainfall that would come afterwards go into the ground. So it would come and directly peel everything up and create the inundations that devastate the country, as McPhee had said in his book. Slides, all kinds of bad things, debris flows that could carry cars or vehicles in the process. It has happened, and it happens here every once in a while. There's a place up in north of say Riverside, north of Riverside, where these situations happen to recur very often, regularly. Let's put it that way. Okay, so Hortonian overland flow describes, as Horton had said, the process that takes place when rainfall rate exceeds infiltration capacity. Saturation overland flow describes the process that takes place after the soil profile has become saturated. There's always a soil profile, be it a meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, whatever you want to talk in feet, say 3 feet, 10 feet, but there's always a soil profile. So when the soil is saturated, then the water will go on the run on the surface as runoff, regardless of the rate of infiltration. So at that point, the rate of infiltration is not a problem. The problem is what's the volume of the reservoir that is going to be filled before it starts running off on the surface. So these two are two complementary and completely different processes. And this is what it's going to make the difference between the curve number and the others. And that's why we discuss it in here. Through flow, I don't want to talk too much about through flow. It's the invention of Mr. Kirkby and Shorley, 1967. Direct channel interception, not too much to talk about, only to recognize it, because it could be important in certain places. Like we have, for instance, runoff in Arizona. The Arizona rivers are wide. They're shallow and wide. They like have 300 meters, so 1,000 feet wide. And the depth is very small and full of sand. So they also have a lot of channel infiltration in there. But if it rains, a whole lot of the water is raining on the channel. So that they got to be considered because it may be substantial. And finally, surface phenomena, and I already talked about that. So let's go into the historical background. How did this method, the runoff curve number method, originate? Well, Sherman had worked on it. Sherman is the inventor of the unit hydrograph, and I'm going to be talking about the unit hydrograph later on. I will begin with Sherman because all studies of the unit hydrograph begin with Sherman. Marcus, our friend, Vic Marcus. Who is Vic Marcus? The entire focus of my CN oral history interview was based on Marcus. Okay? And so Vic Marcus was working for the Soil Conservation Service since the 1930s. And he was given the job to develop a method, an infiltration method. And so he did. But he worked on it for 20 years. And in 1954, they came up with a runoff curve number. They were told to do it and they did it. He did it. He was instrumental in developing. Now, he didn't do the whole thing because those projects are huge and involve a whole lot of people. But he was involved in the crux of the method. The crux meaning the essence of the method. Okay, you could say in the parlance today is the kernel of the method. That was Marcus's responsibility in the 40s, throughout the 30s, 40s, and early 50s. Okay, the origination of this, or the forerunner of these formulas was number 2, but that didn't take too long. And then Marcus came up with his relationship, which we're going to talk about today. And these are the characteristics of the runoff, of the Marcus equation. It's a PQ, rainfall runoff relation. The runoff depth is bounded, and I'll show you the graph. Rainfall depth grows unbounded. The actual retention asymptotically approaches a constant value S, for S meaning storage. That is the potential maximum retention. And I call it just potential retention because potential maximum appears to be a little bit redundant. Runoff equation, which Marcus developed it. He developed the runoff equation and a curve parameter, which is related to S. And the estimates for CN, in other words, we have to estimate the curve number. The curve number could be typically between 45 and 98. Hardly ever gets to 100 and hardly ever gets below 45. Because if you got below 45, you wouldn't have runoff. And if you wouldn't have runoff, you wouldn't be hired to do any calculation. It's simple like that. You cannot tell the people that want you to tell them what the flood was, come back and say, you know what, there's no flood. That doesn't happen, okay? So the estimates are based on hydrologic soil group. So that was the first thing they wanted to do. What's the soil? Is it sand? Is it gravel? Is it silt? Is it clay? Is it a mix of either, of all of these? 2, land use and treatment classes. Land use is important and treatment is important also. Why? Because these people at the Soil Conservation Service, particularly MACAs, were charged with doing agricultural hydrology. That's what they were doing. Although people don't realize that later on, but that's exactly what they were doing. Remember our 105 ways of doing hydrology. Well, one of them was agricultural. When this is exactly what we're doing in here, because the Soil Conservation Service was tasked by the federal government by protecting the soil that had been or had become unprotected due to agriculture. If it had not been for the fact that we needed to conserve the soils, the federal government would have never put together the Soil Conservation Service at great expense. I believe the number of employees of the Soil Conservation Service, the last time I checked, was 50,000 employees, federal employees. They have agencies in various places and so on and so forth. As you know, that costs money. So what is the runoff curve number equation? This equation 3 is the famous or infamous, whoever you talk to, Marcus equation. Marcus is his name. F to S, S, Q to P. F is equal to the actual retention. S, the potential retention. Q, actual runoff, and P, the potential runoff. Now, in the, let me go see, I forgot the name. In the Horton equation, the more it rains, the more it infiltrates, the less it floods. It's a subtractive process. The more it infiltrates, the more water infiltrates, the less it floods because the less is left to run off. So that is a subtractive process. Marcus tried to do that, but he couldn't get anywhere. Eventually, after so many years, like 20 years of data, he told me that in the interview, the famous interview, he came up with this equation. That's the one that fitted the data. This equation, number 3, fitted the data. But note that this equation, if you carefully look at it, as I have, it says that the more it rains, that the more it stores, the more it will run off. In other words, it's contrary to the Horton equation. The rationale is contrary to the Horton equation. So when I first looked at this, I was really curious about how he had put it together. And then eventually, this was in 1989, when I wrote my book. I had to write my book on the curve number. I could not put the curve number aside. And I felt that there was something fishy about this thing. And then in 1993, when I met with Hawkins, and I said, well, we're going to write this paper. So we wrote the paper, and I studied and studied and studied this whole thing again, okay? And then in 1996, when the paper was published, one of the discussers, whose name I don't want to mention at this point, it doesn't matter, one of the 3 discussers, criticized us very, I guess you could say, strongly, okay, to put it mildly. So then I talked to Hawkins, and I decided to go to the Lion's Mouth. I said, I'm going to go talk to Marcus about it so that he can illustrate me as to how exactly is it that he got this equation 3 and its modification, equation 4, which is the actual equation that was used in the models. So 3 was the beginning and 4 was the end, okay? Because he had to subtract the initial abstraction from these because he was told by his bosses that he had to do it. He didn't want to do it. He felt that it was better that he not mess with it. Too complicated a problem to make it even more complex. But he was not the boss. He was just a soldier. the boss said, no, I'm sorry, Vic, you gotta have to introduce the initial abstraction because we have a team of consultants. They've all agreed that the initial abstraction is necessary, and therefore he had to do it. So that's equation 4. So I wanted to query Vic on how he got to this equation. I knew he was going to say, well, the data justified it, but still, you know. So I decided to interview him. So I went over to DC, talked to my friends in DC. Fortunately, I have friends in DC because I've done work, quantity and quality. And I talked to Don Woodward and I said, Don, I would like to, I know I have to close the paper, and I would like to interview Vic. And he's still alive, right? He said, yeah, he's still alive. He says, you know what? Good luck. He says, good luck. He used the word good luck. Professor Ponce, the Professor Ponce say good luck. That's an overstatement, okay? Because I always have good luck. So I said, oh, really? How is that? He said, well, Vic doesn't want to talk to anybody. And long story made short, because I'm going to repeat all that. So I'm not going to talk about that right now, the personal things. But the point is that I did interview Vic Marcus against all odds. And I asked him point blank, where'd you get this equation? And he says, well, one evening in the kitchen table after having tried many other alternative possibilities. This equation seemed to be the one that would best fit the data. He used those words. So I'm repeating for you and for the history of this whole thing, because CN oral history, right, of how this thing happened. I got it none other than from the lion's mouth. This thing was developed one evening at the kitchen table after having tried many other alternative solutions. I could relate to Vic because when I did my S-curve, I told you, great work. My best work, the S-curve. In 1976, I also did it on the kitchen table because we were working at night. We were working after dinner, okay? So I can relate to what he said about the kitchen table. Interesting story, and I will come back to repeat that later on. But he had to put the CIVE, the initial abstraction, as a function of the storage because they wanted to have the method be only one parameter. So they had to figure out what the lambda was. The lambda was the relationship between the CIVE and the S. And there was, I'm sure there was arguments out there as to what to use for lambda. And finally, they zero on lambda equal 0.2. The correlation was not very good. I would say there was probably a 40–50% correlation. But they had no choice, and they were antsy. They wanted to get the method out. And so they said, well, 0.2, that's it. Now, this method 0.2 has been subjected to criticism. When I was in India, they said they were using 0.1 here and 0.3 there. So the Indian people, the Indian engineers had already studied this, and I wouldn't argue with them because they're very capable, right? Indian scientists are very capable. And they said that they had changed it. When I came back around the year 2000, I met Hawkins again. And Hawkins told me, Ponce, he said, I've been working on the lambda and we have come out with a definite conclusion that 0.2 is too high. We are going to recommend 0.05. I said, Pete, I mean, that's interesting. I don't, how can I say, I don't doubt you. Because you say you have a lot of students and you have a lot of data. They gave you all the data. You got the best data and the best students, or some of the, perhaps not the best, but you have a lot of students out there. So therefore, the number 0.05 that Hawkins developed over the year 2000 all the way to 2005, 2006 is now being considered as the replacement for the lambda, 0.2. And hopefully or presumably it will be done. And I'm telling you this information that it will be done because it's in the future. It hasn't been done yet. But all my gut feeling is that it will be done. I have told those people, in no uncertain terms, when they asked me during the oral interview, that they should do it. Anybody can make a mistake. Even the mighty Soil Conservation Service can make a mistake. All they need to do is redo it and then give it to the next generation of engineers. They will forget that it was ever 0.2 and they will use 0.05. So that's the story. Now, as far as this equation here, equation 8, which is is a mysterious equation. And when I first looked at it, I couldn't figure out why he had done this. But later I got a little smarter. When I was in India in 1992, the Indian engineers asked me, they said, where'd they get this equation? And to be honest with you, I hadn't thought about it. I took it at face value. How was I going to argue with the Soil Conservation Service? It was sure dead. So I said, no. This is equation, that's their equation, period. Later on, I have gotten smart, and I have realized that this is just what it used to be called, what is the name? Change of variable, or there's a word for it right now. It doesn't come to my mind. It's a change of variable. You change the S to the CN by using this equation. But where do the 1010 come? And the answer is, these are Marcus's values. If you want to make another change, you can put in there 505 for all I care. But it would not be Marcus's. It would be yours. It would not be the official SCS parameters or values. So therefore, nobody can do it, should do that. This is a transformation that was built into the manual, none other than Marcus by himself, by none other than Marcus. So these numbers, 10 and 100, are cast in concrete over there. They're not going to be moved. There is no need to move them. This is just a very convenient change of variable. Okay, and once we get over here, and you finalize over here, and that's basically it. Now, the issue of antecedent moisture is one that really merits some time over here. I had a meeting with Don Woodward back in 1996, the same year I interviewed Marcus. I remember I was interested in plants. Oh, me, civil engineer. But I had come from the Pantanal. I had recently done work, my third project on the Pantanal. In the Pantanal, you know, the Pantanal is everything. The Pantanal is water, soils, everything, geology, plants. So I was interested in plants. So I told Don, I said, I want to go to visit the Arboretum over in DC. So we met for 2 or 3 hours in the Arboretum. I remember that night or the evening, looking at the trees and the plants, not knowing exactly what we were looking at, but we were having fun. So he told me a lot of things. Who is Don Woodward? At the time, he was the keeper, the SCS keeper. SCS, no, because at the time they changed names, but that doesn't matter. He was the keeper. He was the man in charge, in charge of the curve number method as far as the nation was concerned. His title was National Hydrologist. By the way, in Educa, National Hydrologist, meaning the head scientist in the Soil Conservation Service, now called Natural Resources Conservation Service. So I was talking to none other than the National Hydrologist. And he said, well, I said, well, Don, give me some tips. How is it that you guys decided to take everything there is and put it into 4 boxes? The soils, the treatment. The treatment was very important for them because it was agriculture. The third one is for grazing, which is a nice thing. It's a nice thing to have. It's like a little knob. And then the fourth one is a big one. I said, there's a lot of variability out there in the fourth one. He looked at me, smiled, and revealed a secret hitherto unknown to me and to 99% of the people. It was unknown to me, it was unknown to a lot of people. He said, well, you know, Ponce, we had about 7 sources of variability. 1, 2, 3. But we didn't want to put 7 sources of variability into the model. It was going to be too complex. So we did one, the more important one, the soils. Then we did the treatment, which was the second in our minds. The third one was iffy, but we put in there the grazing. And in the fourth, we bundled everything else and named it AMC because AMC was the lead factor. It's like saying 1, 2, 3. We have 4, 5, 6, 7. We're going to bundle 5, 6, 7 into 4 and call it 4. They didn't call it everything else. That would have been not kosher, okay? So they said antecedent moisture. So the antecedent moisture is now a source of all the variability in the curve number method. And Achilles heel, because people are saying, hey, there's so much variability there, antecedent moisture is not worth a darn, and this and this and that. But that is the point. The system, the method, the process is very complex. It's very complex, and we have succeeded in coming up with a method that is reasonably working reasonably well. It's working reasonably well, although it has its detractors, and I will have a chance to talk about who he is and why he is doing that. Okay, that will come out later. Okay, so this whole thing, then you can go ahead and read it on your own time later on. I want you to read this paper because there will be questions and problems in the questions on the exam on the subject. And by the way, this is an easy paper to read. You haven't seen the other papers. There's tons of papers, and like I told you, it's tough. You have to put a lot of your mind into learning all these subjects. So finally, at the point in here, current numbers evaluated from data, and I give you an example. So you have to review this equation, which you are going to use later on. You can solve for the S from the P and the Q and get this equation from algebra. Okay, then we have other expressions for the curve number, because once this method became widely available throughout the world, the rest of the world didn't like it because it was in units of inches, so they changed it. So there are various ways of expressing this equation. Critique of the curve number. It is a simple? Yes, simple. Predictable? Yes, it's predictable. If you have a P and an S and a curve number, no. If you have a P and a curve number, you get an S. Everybody would get, a Q. With a P, given a P and given a curve number, you get a Q. And everybody will get that. There's no variability there. That's good. Is it stable? Yes, it is stable, provided you don't go below the initial abstraction. Because if you go below the initial abstraction, the algebra turns around and goes high. And that's not in the physics. It's not supposed to do that. It starts at the initial abstraction. I can't explain to you right now, but allow me to say this, that the complete algebra, only part of it works. The other part doesn't work. And I know that because back in the 80s, when I was developing a runoff model, the model didn't work. It just messed up completely. It was out of range. And I got to thinking, what's going on in here? This method must be wrong. But it turned out that I had applied the method wrongly, and I had not imposed the proper limits, and it was giving me answers which were off the bat. So I fixed it. So then the story in here is that it is stable. It's stable provided it's used properly. Why I say stable? Because we know in the mathematical modeling and in the general work that we do, there are some methods that are unstable and give you trash, garbage. And then you don't know if it was the method, it was the data, it was this and was that. Stability is a property, or robustness, I guess you could say, is a property of the method. I could call this method robust, but I don't want to use the word robust because robust is a jargon that is used in numerical analysis. And here we're not talking about numerical analysis. We're talking about just a simple method that was developed by Marcus, and he decided to make it this way, and it turned out to be stable. Okay, rely only on one parameter based on A, hydrologic soil group, A, B, C, D, from sand to clay. A is sand, B, less sand, C, silt, and D, clay. Land use and treatment classes, agricultural, range, forest, and more recently urban. Interestingly, though, the method was developed for agricultural uses because the Soil Conservation Service was an agricultural agency, Department of Agriculture, okay? Since then, since its development back in the year 1954, other segments of the federal government, namely range and forest, and more recently urban, not federal government, urban, the cities, have decided to use the method. So they had to extend it. They had to apply it perhaps blindly. And now we know that the method works well for agriculture. It works much less well, or not as good for range, and it does very poorly for forest. That is one of the questions that I have posed on you for the assignment. So think about what I just said. Okay, hydrologic surface condition of native pasture, that was Marcus's invention. And antecedent moisture, which, as I already told you, it was a bundle for everything. It was a surrogate for all other sources of variability. The only agency methodology that features readily grasped and reasonably well-documented environmental inputs. That's true. well-established method, having widely accepted for use in the United States and other countries. The curve number method is used worldly, globally is the word. It's used globally. Everywhere you go, you're using the curve number. There's literature developed on the curve number everywhere, by the way. Everywhere. I was recently working with some people in Brazil that they were developing curve numbers for Brazilian applications. And they wanted me to think we actually had a meeting on that thing with their faculty members. They wanted to know what I thought about it. So that's interesting. Okay, what are the disadvantages of the method? Here we go. Every method has advantages and disadvantages. Originally developed using regional data, mostly for the Midwestern United States. It was Waco, Texas, Hastings, Nebraska, and Coshocton, Ohio. Those are the three places where MACA spent years figuring out what to do. Okay, but it has been extended by way of practice to the United States and other countries. Some caution is recommended. In some instances, particularly for the lower curve numbers, the method may be very sensitive to the curve number and antecedent condition. When the curves are very close at the beginning or near to the origin, there's going to be high sensitivity to the value of the curve number. And there's nothing we can do about it. It's just part of the beast. That's the way it's going to behave. Okay? The method does best in agricultural sites for which it was originally intended. Its applicability has been extended to urban sites, and the method rates fairly in applications to range sites and generally does poorly in applications to forest sites. Okay, that we know. Why did the Forest Service, and then, the Forest Service actually picked up the method and I used it because they didn't have the wherewithal to develop a method. Apparently, it takes 10 years of research. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the resources, the personnel. So they kind of rode on the method that had been developed for agriculture and they applied it for forest. I believe, and maybe let me say this without realizing that there were two different animals. You can't really compare one hydrology with the other hydrology because of the difference in base flow. Agriculture has no base flow, while the forest does have base flow. And the base flow is not surface runoff. And here we're trying to do surface runoff. So it's a mess. It's really a mess. The method has no explicit provision for spatial scale effect. What's the limit? Marcus told me that it could be applied to 400 square miles. I don't believe it. I mean, not everything that Marcus said is correct. Because Marcus had no chance ever to use the method more than 10 square miles. Because it would have been outside of his purview, outside of his domain. Nobody ever asked Marcus to do a study for 400 square miles. Why? Because the Soil Conservation Service was in the upland, working with the ranchers, with the farms. And there's no way that they could have been called to do an analysis for 400 square miles. As a matter of fact, Marcus said they went up to 10 square miles, and even 10 square miles was stretching it a little bit. Okay? The method fixes the initial abstraction at point 2. At first, this appears to be an advantage. In general, however, lambda could be interpreted as a regional parameter to enhance the method responsiveness for a diversity of geologic and climatic settings. Has it reached maturity? And I'm going to finish in here. The method is widely understood and accepted for what it is, a conceptual model supported by the empirical data. It is a method of choice by practicing engineers and hydrologists for soil and water conservation, planning and design, and flood control design. Replacement method, and here we go. A replacement method, if one is developed, would have to clearly prove its superiority. This has been attempted many times, and they have all failed. Believe me, I know what I'm talking. There's the people come and compare the method, and they say, we can't prove that this one is better than the others. How many other methods are there? Well, there's 3 or 4 or 5 by name, by the way. Some of them preceded even this method. There's the Holton method, this method. The Horton method precedes it. The Horton method is 1935. Holton method, then there's Army Corps has a method too that they developed, I believe, 40, 50 years ago, which, by the way, it's no good. I don't believe it's good. Nobody ever quotes the Army Corps method. And then there's the Phillips and the Green and Amp. The Green and Amp is an old method, 1911. It's basically physics. So some people have said, why should we go the curve number method, which is a conceptual method? Let's go with a deterministic method, which is a Green and Amp. Let's go for it. And that's it. And they go. And they have done work in that area. As a matter of fact, through the 80s, when I was doing work early in my career, not 70s, in the 70s, there were people that wanted to replace the soil conservation method for the green and amp. All right, they said, they were arguing loudly. You should dump the curve number and replace it with the green and amp because it's better. I didn't think so because the parameters of the green and amp are a little bit obscure. And if they're obscure for me, can imagine they will be obscure for just about everybody out there. Okay? So you cannot give the populace a method to apply that has obscure parameters. That's without saying. While the method, the run curve number method, there's nothing obscure about it. It's all very clear. So that's what I would like to say at this point about the runoff curve number. And what I'm going to do in here is go to the discussions, and I'm going to briefly show you a flavor of what can be said in a discussion. When you write a paper, you open up to yourself for criticism. Anybody out there can, within reason, of course, short of insulting you out loud and loudly, can criticize you. And sure enough, they have criticized me, and I don't blame them. And some of them are correct, by the way. So we have this discussion by Golding that is not really transcendental. So I'm going to skip it, but if you're interested, you can read it. And then there's a discussion by another person, which over here, let me see. There's a discussion over here, next page. Kind of next page in here. And there's another discussion by Willicke. And like I say, those discussions are okay. They're making some comments based on their experience. Everybody does that. You make a comment based on your experience. But I'm going to specifically talk about the Roger Smith discussion. Who is Roger Smith? Let me see, it says it there. Research hydraulic engineer. I'm smiling here because I'm going to tell you a story which is an interesting and fascinating story. Research hydraulic engineer, ARS USDA, Colorado State University, Fort Collins. This was done in the year 1996. I met, if you could call meeting, the experience I had with Roger Smith. I honestly don't know where he's right now. I try to look him up, but Roger Smith is a very common name. But Roger had an office right next to mine for about 4 years. But we hardly ever talked. We were in different tents. I was in this tent and he was in that tent. Never mind, we had an office, contiguous offices. But we basically did not know each other. I knew who he was, he knew who I was, and that was it. I mean, there were 300 people working at that building, okay? So I don't blame him. But the point is that after I left, 16 years later, he has a chance to write a paper or write a discussion on my discussion, or rather my paper. And he did it. And you know what? I wasn't born yesterday. I knew that there was a very strong possibility that Roger was going to criticize me. Why? Because he was considered to be the king of green and amped. And I was not the king, but the purveyor of the methodology for green and amped. So in other words, the competing methodology. So I knew from the beginning that those people that prefer the green and amp method were not going to like what I would say. But we did it because we had a philosophy. Our philosophy was give the practitioner a practical method. Don't give him something he would get confused because he would never use it. Okay? So the subject, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because we don't have time. We only have 10 minutes. But it is interesting and fascinating, by the way. I enjoy reading this. Never mind the criticism. I don't care. Okay? I guess I could say I'm big enough that I can take the criticism. The subject paper constitutes a rather thorough, albeit subjective, treatise, how do you pronounce that, on the widely used curve number runoff method, offering conceptual interpretations on some of its features and various arguments in support of its utility. Discussion feels it necessary and useful to challenge or correct several of the claims, which hopes of preventing misuse or interpretation of this useful estimation. And that's what he does. And I believe in a couple of the places in his long discussion, he may well be in the ballpark. And I may have actually made an oversight or a slight mistake. It was minor mistakes, okay? So I cannot go in detail of this because it would take too long. But let me just go on the next page because it is over here that Okay, he basically says that the curve number method is not responsive because it only has one parameter, and his method has three parameters, so therefore it's more responsive. Well, that's true. That is true. Okay. I could argue with that. My argument to that is that infiltration is very complex. It's a everybody would say it's a very complex subject. Spatial variability, temporal variability, forget it. I mean, those kinds of variability. So we know from experience in our practice of engineering and science that the more complex a method, or rather a procedure, a phenomenon, an event, the simpler has the solution to be. If the procedure is very simple, then the solution has to be very complex. It's the opposite. Think about it. That is precisely the case. You cannot follow complexity with complexity because you'll never finish. Okay? So I think in this case, he quite didn't follow through on this dictum, which I already know I have for a fact. I mean, I have a lot of experience on this. In my chapter 8 of my book, reservoir routing is extremely complex phenomenon. So we had to deal with it simply. In chapter 9, channel routing was relatively straightforward because it was only one straight line. And we had to deal with it in a very complex fashion. If it had been consistency in the procedure, complex would have followed complex and simple would have followed simple. But no, it's exactly the opposite. In practice of science and engineering is exactly the opposite. Think about what I just said. It's hard to digest, but it is true. Okay, so then he's talking about it. It should be emphasized that the curve number method is a nonlinear regression estimate. That is correct. Marcus is nonlinear regression. That's what it is. It's not a linear regression. It's a nonlinear regression. Okay? So he agrees with some of the things we had said. He basically agrees. And at the end, he gives us a pat in the back. I could not believe that Roger would do that, but he did it. I have to admit that he did that. Okay. The cause of storm variability, CN variability, is an important misconception repeated by the authors. I'm not quite sure that he knew this stuff. I'm not quite sure that he had knowledge or was privy to information that I was already privy to. I talked to the boss, to Don Woodward, in the Arboretum, and he spilled all the beans on me. I am not sure that Don ever talked to Roger Smith and spilled any beans on him. So he doesn't know this stuff, okay? So he says, important misconception repeated by the authors. Although in one place this variability is given 4 sources, they go on to state that antecedent moisture is the major source of variability and discuss no others. I didn't say that. I said that the soil conservation had identified 3, and the other 4 bundled it into number 4. That's a different story. He didn't say that. Okay? Okay. Survival basis. Now he's beginning to give me a pat in the back. He says, none of the preceding is to argue that given only rainfall and depth and requiring an estimate of runoff, there's significantly better method for practical use. My gosh, Roger, you could have said that at the beginning. And he's going to continue to do this. He's going to continue to say, yeah, but you guys are right because it's practical. Okay? Okay. So it serves, no, this is a very strong statement. It serves neither science nor engineering to ignore the fact that we know far more about the physics of runoff production that is enshrined in the CN method. Yes, Roger, but infiltration is not just physics. It's not just mechanics or physics. It is chemistry and it is biology. That, of course, that argument he cannot withstand because he is a physicist. He's not a chemist or a biologist. And we know now that infiltration is a complex procedure that covers all 3 fields. So if you want to do a holistic method, you got to be physicist, a chemist, and a biologist. And how many people out there that govern or know the 3 subjects? I submit that hardly anybody. Okay? So we are short on that one. There is an overriding reason for the acceptance of the curve number method, and that it should be admitted by all engineers, and that it is supported by a U.S. government. And it gives users basic protection in case of litigation. That is correct in here. Everybody acknowledges that. If you use the government method, if somebody sues you, all you need to do is, I'm using the manual. Here's the manual. If you want to disagree with the manual, you can do it, but not with me. Okay. So he finally, that's what he said. And he says at the end, he says, it is doubtful finally that the question posed in the title is answered, or even if the question of maturity is the relevant question to ask. We wanted to write a paper on the runoff curve number, and we didn't know how to subtitle it. And we went back and forth with Pete on this, and we finally agreed with, has it reached maturity? My original intent was to say, is it mature or old? But Pete said that was negative. And we came up with we made a middle ground by saying, has it reached maturity? Has it reached maturity? And the answer is, yes, it's being used by everybody. Because that's not maturity, I don't know what maturity is. Okay? That there are some detractors, among them Roger Smith and perhaps a handful of others. But still, the method is there. Okay. The others have provided a subjective view rather than an objective analysis. And that's Professor Ponce. I have a hard time being objective. And I'm going to say that in true form. Everybody has an axe to grind. I submit that there's nobody out there, living or dead, that has not had an axe to grind. So to accuse me of not being totally objective would be out of the question, or rather uncalled for. Part of what is at stake here is belief rather than fact. We submit, or we set out to defend the curve number. That was our subjectivity. We could not open it up for all the methods. We were not doing a study on Rogers' method or anybody's method. There's 4 or 5 methods out there. It was not my job to compare the curve number with the other methods. My job was to show what was good and bad about it, hopefully, that people can live with the bads and use the goods. That's what we did, and I think we did it well. Part of what's at stake is a belief rather than fact. I like that. It remains the comfortable belief of many that the curve number is a measurable watershed property. No, it's not measurable. It's a conceptual method. I think that's wrong. He's wrong there, because the curve number varies with the S, and the S varies anyway. So you cannot measure it per se. And finally, there's also a beauty in the simplicity that has appealed much like that of mythology, right? So we finish with the comment on the KISS principle. The method is popular because it's simple, because of the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. And you heard me repeat this before, and that is a fact. Very complex methods are not read. A case in point, and I'm going to finish with this. Professor Ponce has 52 papers written on the literature for the last 25, 30 years. 52 published papers. I have 200 or 300 others that are not published that are directly on the web. I'm not counting those. Society is counting the published papers. My most popular paper, which 1,300 references, is this one. Okay? Now, there's a couple of papers out there that I wrote when I was young and eager that deal with the math of numerical analysis. And papers that are so difficult, at the time, I don't know how they did it, that I have come back to try to read them, and I can't read them. So if the author of the paper cannot read his own paper, you can imagine who is going to read it. Nobody. And those papers have maybe 2 or 3 references. So why did I write those papers? I don't know. I was young. I was eager and so forth. Made some mistakes, but I wrote those papers that have not been read, and to this point now, not even by myself. As a matter of fact, and I'm going to finish here with a very strong statement, because Professor Ponce is a very strong person. Okay, there's those couple of papers that I wrote that I cannot read now have been quoted by some people that are in the field. They quoted the papers. They said, "Oh, well, Professor Ponce wrote this paper," but they argued against what I said in the paper. In other words, they were saying, "Oh yeah, he wrote this paper and 1 + 1 = 2," and the conclusion that they get is opposite to what I said in the paper. How could that happen? Well, what happens is that they didn't understand or fully read the paper. and they're just quoting it because it's nice to quote a paper that nobody can read. How fascinating, isn't it? Well, with that, I already exceeded my time, and I'm going to finish in here. There are no questions at this point? No? Okay. So I'm just going to stop it. Oh, there I go. Okay, so well, I remind you that you need to choose your topic, by the way. If you do not have ideas or you want some help, just set up an appointment with me for a consultation anytime. Monday, Wednesday, 3 slots, 7 to 7, 7:20, and 7:40. Do that as soon as you can, because I believe that if you have any doubts by now, then you must perhaps need some help on choosing a topic, a good topic that will be good for you, show you, teach you something, and that you can complete in 10 days. I'm sorry, 10 weeks, because week number 6 is the start, and week 16 is the delivery. So you got 10 weeks. Okay? Thank you very much. We'll see you later. Bye-bye. We'll see you Wednesday.